Emily, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ways that purity culture myths can show up, not just in our sexual lives, but in our romantic lives. We talked at length in another episode about how the idea of soulmates can be incredibly pervasive. Even people who don't believe in it can be impacted by it. And a lot of these things that we're talking about can be really sneaky and challenging to even notice in our relationships. So tonight, I wanted to, in particular, talk about the belief that there is like a right way and a wrong way to date, that there's like some prescriptive, natural order, God ordained sort of notion about the relationship escalator and some of these things.
Mhm.
I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the idea that love is like a limited resource, or that you can only love one person. And then I wanted to highlight the idea that marriage or a relationship has certain like non-negotiable built-in things, that word relationship comes with certain requirements. Anything in particular that you might add to that list?
No, I think that's a good start. We'll take it from there, but I think there's enough there that we could go for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's get after it if we can. So to start off with, this idea or this belief that there is like a right way or a wrong way to date. How would we even see that showing up in our lives? Because I feel like most of the people watching this episode are going to be really quick to be like, well, no, I mean, of course you could date fast or slow or whatever, but nevertheless, I think that all of us are in some way impacted by this notion. How true is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the true thing that we have is our own ethics and our own preferences. And those can change over time and they might change with more information. Right? I get that's like very broad, very like therapist anything goes.
Sure.
But but what I mean by that is, right, like I came from this idea, probably a lot of people did, that dating only looked one way. And then I grew up in a sect of fundamentalist Christianity that didn't even believe in dating. Right. The
Mm.
idea that I heard growing up was dating is just practice for divorce. And there's
Oof.
no like worse thing, right, than divorce. When in
Yeah.
reality, I feel like divorce is sometimes one of the best things that can happen to people. Like,
Yeah, the fact that we've gotten this far into a conversation about purity culture without mentioning I kiss dating goodbye feels like a little bit of a disservice. But yeah, that idea was everywhere in the 90s. And I feel like it is still in the soil that we grow our food in. Like it is still in the air that we breathe and shows up in so many different places.
yeah, and I think a lot of those ideas sort of jumped into the broader culture because I knew people that didn't grow up religious that still had this idea that like dating too many people was bad, or that it would somehow like damage you emotionally if you dated a lot of people while you were young in particular. Um, so I'm like, that idea, it didn't even stay in religious circles. It like
Mm.
kept going, right? And has continued effects on, I think, multiple generations of people, of young people at this point. Um, so this idea that like there's one right way to date, or that real dating or the best dating looks a certain way and maybe tries to prevent pain. That's another thing that I think I got, was like this idea that, well, if you date the right way, it won't be hard and it won't be painful. When we know that like relationships are painful in a lot of ways, one, because growing is painful in
Mm.
certain ways, and two, people are people. And if you're engaging with them in any way, whether that's dating or family or community activism, you're going to push each other's buttons. You're going to be in really uncomfortable situations. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong. I think this
Mm.
idea that like discomfort or pain means that there's something wrong or morally wrong is very dangerous, because one, it doesn't give us any skills to overcome like discomfort as a part of life. And two, it like puts this moral idea on like human interactions that are sort of socially constructed more than anything else. Like, dating is a ritual depending on what kind of culture you live in and what time period you're in. And like the right ways of dating are always sort of dictated by the norms of the moment.
Yeah, and they're going to differ from person to person. So if you have two different people that both believe that there is only one right way to date, but it's their way and not their partner's way, you're going to end up with all kinds of misunderstandings and conflicts. And it can kind of create this notion that, well, my partner doesn't care about me, or my partner doesn't love me correctly because their love doesn't fit into my box. And instead of negotiating these things, instead of like asking for what we want and talking about what we don't want, we instead just assume that, well, because they're not loving me the right way, then they must not actually love me.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stories that I think are very quick to develop about people, especially in close relationships, right? That like the idea that someone's actions mean something, right? Like you quickly jump to conclusions where you're like, this thing happened, it must mean I am unlovable, or it must mean that they're not doing something right, or it must mean that our relationship isn't going to work because, this thing is happening already, or we're not doing enough of this. Like those ideas, I think, can really pull people away from the momentary experiences that they're having in relationships and the choices that they're making to continue or restrict or negotiate or change, or any of these other ways that we can sort of take relationships three-dimensionally are just sort of right or wrong based on this very like flat, limited, small understanding of each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is such a problem that people are often unable to communicate about these things.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to be a marriage and family therapist to recognize that communication is perhaps the number one issue in any relationship that is getting a little bit rocky. And I feel like you have to become aware of some of these assumptions, some of these purity culture myths that get really embedded in us in order to be able to talk about them. So that's part of why I feel like this work of deconstructing is so important, so that we can begin to recognize that there are differences between what we believe and what the person we're talking to believes, rather than just assuming that there's like some proper, right, natural order, God ordained strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about the idea that love is a limited resource, that you can only love one person, or that if you care about people outside of your partner, that that's just like a pie that's getting carved up, and you're somehow like taking something away from the people that matter most to you.
Mm-hmm. Right. The idea that monogamy is the only right way to live, or like alternately, that like monogamy has no value and should not have any value to people,
Sure.
are both, I think, ideas that like just get really messy and destructive really fast. Anytime you're dictating the right or wrong way for somebody else's relationship, you're gonna end up in some trouble. You're gonna sort of miss out on the fact that people are going to have different experiences of relationships at different times. Like if love was truly limited, you wouldn't be able to have friends and family and a partner or partners, right? But plenty of people do and can thrive in those situations. And so if you're limiting yourself from this idea that you might be drawn to, like I'd like to explore ideas of, relationships outside of monogamy, or sex outside of, the ideas that I was raised with. Like if you're cutting yourself off from those, you're cutting yourself off from growth and pleasure and experiences that, if this life is all we have, are worth checking out.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that even folks who choose to live monogamously, if they are doing so out of a sense of like fear and avoidance, they are often not just missing out on like possible experiences, because it's totally valid to choose not to have those types of experiences. But I can't help but feel like they are creating this like cage around their relationship that can really make the relationship itself start to feel toxic or start to feel suffocating in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, well, something else I wanted to throw in here is the idea that a relationship has to last for the rest of your lifetime, or
Mhm.
be a like till death do us part, in order to be valid, or in order to count, as if we are all just sort of like dating, going through the test to see whether or not this relationship is going to go the distance. And then if it doesn't, that we're just wasting our time on our way to like our one true romance. So this notion that endings are a failure and that true romance lasts forever, how do you react to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea keeps a lot of people stuck in a lot of relationships that are no longer serving them,
Mm,
right? This idea that you would be admitting failure by acknowledging the end of a relationship as you maybe understood it in the past, it is can be abusive in a lot of ways. Like it can be a tactic that someone would use to hold power over another. Like really, you're gonna, our community, our family just spent all this money on a wedding, and like if you leave now, you're just gonna, be taking something from someone. When I think at the whole, relationships are supportive and engaging in different levels of mutuality. And if something has reached the end, letting it go is one of the best things that you can do to honor that, right?
mm.
To honor a relationship to its completion, whatever that looks like. If that's just one night, right? Then one afternoon, like that
That can
is
be
a
beautiful.
valuable like completion like of a relationship, that there's a necessary ending at all points, and that death might be one ending, right? But there's a lot of other endings along the way. And if you're willing to cast all of those relationships aside, or to, be overwhelmed by shame about them, you're going to miss out on a lot of what's right now and what's good, and then what's next and what's coming, and what might be available to you if you're willing to be courageous.
Mm-hmm. Well, just before the show, we had a email come in, and as a female therapist, I am actually really curious to hear your response. Very quickly, let me read through this.
Great.
Uh, it starts off, "Hi, I see a therapist for depression, which has really helped me. I am a 51-year-old man, and my therapist is a 26-year-old woman. I'm very attracted to her, and I think she has feelings for me, but I'm not sure. She has a live in boyfriend and rarely talks about him. Just recently, she has been giving me a different level of attention. I can ask her intimate questions about her sexual desires and preferences, and she answers honestly. We text each other all the time. She even takes me to physical therapy appointments. I don't know what's going on here. Is she sending signals and waiting for me to take charge and ask for a real date? I'm too chicken to point blank ask. I'm afraid to lose this new high. It's almost like it's better to assume and fantasize there's something there. It would be devastating to learn she is just being nice. What should I do? How can I lightly test my hunch without blowing this up in my face? Signed, confused and in love."
Mm.
Whew, lot to unpack there. How
Yeah.
how do you react to that?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like, if I'm just working backwards, like why would it be devastating to realize that someone was being nice to you? Right? Like what is
Mm,
devastating about experiencing niceness for what it is, right? Like
yeah.
why does that seem less valuable than, your idea of fantasy and love? The next thing that comes to mind is, depending on, a person's employer and the way that they are working as a therapist, there might be some, extra support that comes with that. So depending on your context, in social work, there might be times where you're in someone's home to give them the care that they need, or to be a resource for them, or to help people navigate appointments, things like that, that might be just part of this person's job. So there's a lot of like reading of signals and in developing of stories, right?
That's
And
a great way of framing it.
yeah. And so we can kind of have a discussion about like, well, do these signals all mean this story that this writer has? My first inclination is that it probably doesn't. That would seem very unlikely, and it would actually cross a lot of ethical, legal, and moral codes, right? That as therapists, we have unique positions in people's lives. We have unique power. And that means we have a very specific set of requirements that says how we get to navigate and interact with people. And falling in love with a client or starting a relationship with a client is unacceptable in any code of practice in any state that I know of, right?
Yeah,
Because
no,
it is.
that's worth just underlining and highlighting over and over that it would be unacceptable for this relationship to move forward.
Mhm,
I might say that it's okay to have a crush on your therapist. It can really get in the way of the work that you're doing. And if
mhm,
you are at this place where you're having these like anxious romantic feelings, it might be a good idea to move on to a different therapeutic relationship. It seems unlikely to me that this therapeutic relationship is serving you. There
mhm,
are certainly situations where perhaps having some of these thoughts can be constructive in some ways. I'll acknowledge for myself as a client specifically, not as a therapist, but myself being a client working with a therapist. I have sometimes developed, or on one particular occasion, I developed some of those kinds of feelings, and it ended up being incredibly therapeutic for me because it was a safe space to explore same sex attraction in my head. In reality, to move forward with this relationship would be incredibly inappropriate. And even if there is some version of this somewhere out in the multiverse where you could possibly have a great experience together, the reality is I wouldn't want to be in a relationship with somebody that would be so willing to throw away their career and violate their ethics and their moral standards in order to be with me. So, to confused and in love, I want to extend to you some empathy and some concern while really, really suggesting to you that you reevaluate whether or not this therapeutic relationship is actually serving you, and strongly insisting that you not move to move further with any of these romantic feelings. Does that
mhm.
all feel fair, Emily?
Yeah, absolutely. The last thing that I want to point out is just some gender expectations that I think that slip in, right? That
Sure.
women there are a number of women who are drawn to sort of helping professions, right? Because we are socialized to be helpers. Like anyone who's, raised in that the set of expectations that we give to women or to girls is going to have, like, you sort of have to learn how to nurture to survive in a
Hmm.
lot of situations. And I'm thinking about how people are drawn to professions where they get to do what they're good at for their job, right? Like I'm one of those people. And yet it has to come with this idea that like what I am doing to be good at my job might be misread as something different, as something romantic or sexual, simply because there's this expectation on me that, like, as a woman, my helping is sexualized. So I'm
Right.
also just thinking of, like, as a female therapist, reading a story, my affinity is for the female therapist in this story, and that my ideas of protecting their work, as it's explained in this note, would be to say this might be really good work, and I hope it
Sure.
is treated as valuable rather than romanticized or sexualized.
Yeah. Yeah, and my own experience of developing that crush was for a lot of those reasons that you highlighted. It was because I was working with a professional that created a safe space and
Mhm.
that sort of allowed me to explore feelings. I mean, I didn't vocalize these feelings towards him, but I felt safe. I felt attached, and that's just a sign that he was doing good therapeutic work. And for my own part, I don't know that I would have been able to develop those feelings if I didn't feel like he was somebody that would be responsible to shut
Mhm.
them down if I ever actually said them out loud, which is
Right.
exactly what would need to happen here if Confused and in Love ever actually did say these things. So,
Mhm.
again, no judgment. We definitely feel for you, but would strongly encourage you to maybe change course here and to think about these things.